At the peak of its popularity, the show just vanished.
I just want to ask our governors and whom it concerns, us loggers in North Carolina, we're hurting right now, and we need some help.
For 4 seasons, Discovery Channel handed America a window into a job most people had never even thought about. Chainsaws, track machines the size of small houses, black swamp water up to the axles, and a man named Bobby Goodson standing in the middle of all of it, running a family logging business that had been passed down through 4 generations. When Swamp Loggers finally went off the air, the cameras packed up and left. Bobby didn't. And what happened to him in the years that followed is a story that never got its own episode. One that involves a family business, a battle with addiction most fans never knew about, a fuel crisis that finally brought a decades-old company to its knees, and a man who, through all of it, never stopped being exactly who he was on day one. Goodson's all-terrain logging was never invented for television. Bobby Goodson came from 4 generations of loggers working the wetlands around Jacksonville, North Carolina, in Pender County, territory so waterlogged and unforgiving that conventional logging equipment simply couldn't operate there. Long before any producer picked up a phone, Bobby had already built a business specifically engineered to work where other loggers wouldn't go. Swamp-rated skidders, custom fella bunches, and clam bunk trucks capable of hauling timber out of standing water. That specialization is what eventually caught Hollywood's attention. When a production crew from Pilgrim Films showed up in the mid-2000s to scout the operation, Bobby has said he had no idea what he was actually agreeing to. He expected one guy with a camera. Instead, several SUVs pulled in with more than a dozen crew members, lighting rigs, and boom mics, and Bobby found himself surrounded before he'd even climbed out of his truck. He later admitted his first reaction was closer to alarm than excitement, a normal response for a man who had spent his whole life running a logging crew, not managing a television production. Swamp Loggers premiered on Discovery Channel in the summer of 2009 and ran for 4 seasons, wrapping in January 2012. It followed Bobby, his son Justin, his wife Lori, who ran the company's office, and a rotating crew of operators and truck drivers as they tried to hit weekly timber quotas in conditions that would stall out almost any other logging operation in the country. Audiences got hooked on the same thing that made the business itself remarkable. There was nothing manufactured about it. The mud was real, the breakdowns were real, and the risk of a multi-ton machine sinking into soft ground was a genuine, everyday hazard rather than a scripted plot point. What the show captured less of was the toll that kind of filming takes on a working business. Bobby and his crew still had quotas to meet, equipment to keep running, and payroll to cover, all while accommodating a production schedule that had its own separate demands. Justin, who worked alongside his father throughout the show's run, later described the experience as ultimately a good one, though not without its frustrations, production crews getting in the way at exactly the wrong moment, long days made longer by retakes and coverage shots. It was, in his words, a fun but occasionally aggravating experience, and one that produced an enormous amount of footage for very little actual airtime, reportedly around 200 hours of filming condensed into each 44-minute episode. When Discovery chose not to bring Swamp Loggers back for a 5th season, there was no farewell tour, no dramatic send-off. The show simply stopped airing, and Bobby Goodson went back to doing what he'd always done, running Goodson's all-terrain logging out of Pender County, extracting timber from wetlands that most contractors in the region wouldn't touch. This is the part of Bobby's story that tends to get flattened into a single line in most recaps. He went back to logging, when in reality it says something specific about who he is. Reality television has turned plenty of ordinary tradespeople into full-time personalities, chasing spin-off shows, sponsorships, and public appearances long after the cameras that made them famous have moved on to the next subject. Bobby didn't take that path. He didn't rebrand himself, didn't shop a follow-up series, didn't lean on his newfound recognition to build a media career. He went home and kept logging, because logging, not being on television, was always the actual job. For the better part of a decade after the show ended, Goodson's all-terrain logging kept operating the way it always had, a family-run outfit specializing in work almost nobody else in the region was equipped to do. Bobby stayed connected to the audience that had followed the show, posting updates on Facebook, sharing glimpses of ongoing jobs, and occasionally reflecting on the years since Swamp Loggers had aired. There was no bitterness in those updates and no performance either. It was simply a man who had built something real, still doing the work that had defined his entire adult life. There's a part of Bobby Goodson's story that predates the show entirely and that most Swamp Loggers fans never learned from the series itself. Bobby has spoken openly, in interviews given years after the show ended, about growing up around alcohol and drugs from an extremely young age, describing school-age memories that included being intoxicated as a young child and a long stretch of his life, in which he says he couldn't recall a single day without using something. That history isn't something Discovery Channel packaged into an episode. It's something Bobby chose to talk about later. In his own words, once the cameras that had once followed his logging jobs weren't around to shape the narrative. What Bobby has credited with turning that chapter of his life around is his Christian faith, a shift he and Lori both point to as the actual foundation the rest of their lives, the marriage, the business, the family that now includes their children, Justin and Brittany, and several grandchildren, was rebuilt on. It's a piece of Bobby Goodson's biography that rarely makes it into the highlight reel version of his story, and it reframes the unshakable, hard-working swamp logger persona audiences saw on television. The steadiness fans admired wasn't just a personality trait. For Bobby, it was something he has said he had to fight to build, long before a single Discovery Channel camera ever pointed in his direction. Television exposure never changed the fundamental economics of swamp logging, and through the 2010s those economics were shifting in ways that made an already difficult business even less forgiving. Independent logging outfits across the American South were increasingly squeezed by consolidation in the timber industry, rising equipment costs, and a business model that left almost no room for absorbing a bad year. Swamp-rated equipment isn't like standard logging machinery. It costs more to buy, wears out faster in constant moisture and mud, and requires specialized parts that aren't sitting on a shelf at the nearest supplier. For an operation like Goodson's, that meant heavier maintenance costs, more downtime waiting on repairs, and a business model that depended on every piece of equipment staying productive nearly every day it was in the field. None of that was new. Bobby had been managing exactly those pressures for decades. What changed, gradually, was how many of those pressures were stacking up at once, with fewer contracts available to fall back on when one of them hit. By 2020, the margin for error that had always been thin in swamp logging had shrunk even further, and then the pandemic arrived and compressed it from every direction at once. Mill shutdowns during the early COVID-19 lockdowns meant there were periods when logging outfits across the region had nowhere to actually sell the timber they harvested, and a business built around heavy machinery doesn't stop generating fixed costs just because the mills stopped buying. Equipment loans, insurance, and the need to keep an experienced crew intact didn't pause along with everything else. Then came the fuel problem, which turned out to be the one that mattered most. Diesel is not a minor line item in a logging operation. It powers every machine in the field and every truck hauling timber out of it. And when fuel prices climbed sharply in the years following the pandemic, the math on some holes simply stopped working. Bobby addressed this directly and without dressing it up. On site and loads, the cost of the diesel required to haul timber from the swamp to the mill was higher than what that timber was actually worth once it got there. That isn't a problem that better scheduling or harder work can solve. When the basic arithmetic of a job goes negative, there's no operational fix for it. In May 2022, Bobby Goodson announced, standing alongside Lori, that Goodson's all-terrain logging was closing. He pointed to the cost of fuel as the deciding factor, the expense that had finally made it impossible to keep the business running the way it needed to run. There was no dramatic production around the announcement, no press conference. Bobby simply spoke to the people who had followed his family story for over a decade, the same way he always had, directly, plainly, and without spin. The reaction from longtime fans was immediate. People who remembered Bobby, Justin, and the rest of the Goodson's crew from the original Discovery run showed up to express genuine appreciation for what the family had built and genuine sympathy for what it meant to see it end. It wasn't the closure of some anonymous company. For a lot of viewers, it was the end of a business they'd watched, week after week, more than a decade earlier, one that had somehow kept going long after the show that introduced most of the country to it had gone off the air. What stood out in how Bobby handled the closure was the same thing that had made swamp loggers resonate with audiences in the first place. He told the truth about it. He didn't frame it as a personal failure, and he didn't dress it up as anything other than what it was, an independent business finally overwhelmed by costs completely outside his control. 4 generations of logging experience, a business that had survived a national television spotlight and a decade of industry consolidation afterward, had run into a wall that no amount of skill or work ethic could get around. Since the closure, Bobby has remained a visible, active presence for the community that grew up watching his family story unfold, responding to fans, sharing updates, and staying engaged on social media the same way he did throughout the years between the show's end and the company's closing. There's been no reinvention for the cameras, no pivot into a media career built off nostalgia for swamp loggers. What's continued instead is the same through line that ran across the entire arc of Bobby Goodson's public life, a working man who built something difficult and specific, sustained it through decades most people never saw, was honest about the personal struggles that shaped him long before television found him, and was equally honest when the business that outlasted his television career finally reached its limit. Bobby Goodson's story doesn't fit neatly into either of the templates reality television usually produces, the quiet fade into obscurity, or the reinvention into a full-time personality. Instead, it's the story of a family logging operation that predated the cameras, survived them, and kept going for another decade under its own weight, until an industry-wide fuel crisis did what nothing else could. It's also, less visibly, the story of a man who was fighting a private battle with addiction long before any of it, and who has been open, later in life, about what actually got him through it. Taken together, it's not the story swamp loggers told on Discovery Channel. It's the fuller one that came after, and, in some ways, the one that came before it, too. What do you think about Bobby Goodson's journey from swamp loggers to the closing of Goodson's all-terrain logging? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next.